Stephen Nathan is usually with us on a Tuesday, but today we have you right at the beginning of the week. Nice to see you, Stephen. There's a very interesting piece that's coming up from the Financial Times a little later in our program tonight, talking about house prices around the world in an absolute boom. It's only 3 countries that they monitor at the FT have house prices that have not been rising sharply during the pandemic. One of those countries is not hard to imagine because we know where we sit in South Africa. Is this, maybe just to start off with, is it a surprise to see that in the pandemic, with more people perhaps working from home, that house prices have been rising, and particularly in the United States, where often they're selling those houses for more than the asking price?
Yes, I think, intuitively, the sort of knee-jerk reaction is, yes, it is surprising, because I think COVID, we expected a lot more of a negative economic impact globally, and we haven't seen that. And to the credit of central banks, it's really been the proactive nature of central banks that have aggressively supported the economy. And one can't underestimate how aggressive it's been. It's been unprecedented, and it's worked. So what it's done, one of the big impacts is that it's lowered interest rates globally. So interest rates are much lower, and the vast majority of people who who buy a home have to finance that via a mortgage. So it's kind of, the lower interest rates are, the more affordability you've got. So your money stretches further. So when interest rates fall, you can afford to buy a more expensive property for the same monthly repayment. And we know that interest rates are at record lows. Also, I think what's important with interest rates is sort of the bank margin. So in South Africa, although our interest rates are at sort of record lows, certainly lows over the last 50 years, we have a repo rate at 3.5%. So that means that the commercial banks can borrow from the Reserve Bank at 3.5%. But the banks have a high margin. They put on another 3.5% to get their prime rate. So, if you look globally, those bank margins are also very high. So there's a bit of a double whammy that we have in South Africa, because we've got high bank margins and we've got much higher interest rates than they have elsewhere. And even if you look, for example, at the UK and the US, they have what we call negative real interest rates, because inflation is higher than interest rates. So it's actually very positive to stimulate demand for housing. And also what we've learned sort of in the pandemic is that people's homes have become more important, because your home is not just a place where you live. It's become part of your work life as well. So you've had people sort of trading up, buying bigger properties. So that's also been positive for it. So unfortunately, in South Africa, we've missed out on that, because I think, in addition to not having the benefit of low interest rates, also the sentiment in South Africa is not great. Property transactions are not buoyant, whereas internationally they're very buoyant, and also the government's done other things to help. So, for example, in the UK, quite shortly after COVID, when it first hit, so probably around about April, May of last year, the government reduced property tax. They had a transfer tax, so they had a sort of a moratorium to stimulate the market. And I think that's something we really lack in South Africa, is a proactive monetary policy to help the economy get back on its feet. Another thing that's also quite interesting is that in the US, when you borrow for a home, you actually get, your interest is tax deductible. So that's another incentive, because the US, they're very pro home ownership, and it's a statistic that they watch very closely, and it's something that they promote. So they've got a lot of incentives. They even have the government, what they call government-sponsored entities. So we might have heard of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which actually buy these mortgages. So there's a lot of sort of facilitation to get that going. It's generally an attractive market for the homeowner, for the buyer. And COVID has on top of that, created much lower interest rates and some more tax incentives along the way.
That's very interesting. The point of trying to promote home ownership, trying to get a bigger middle class, is something that we've completely missed in South Africa, perhaps because of political ideology. But a bigger story to all of this is the value of South African assets generally. Magnus Haystack has been going to town on this story for a while now, saying that not only is our GDP per capita falling, in other words, that our economy is growing slower than the population growth in South Africa, but that the value of our assets in global terms has also been declining. How serious is that? Do we really need to worry about that, given that we are citizens and living in South Africa? And I guess for the majority of people in this country, you're not really going to be looking to take your assets or try and establish yourself elsewhere. Of course, there are many people who want to do that, but for most people, they're not really thinking along those lines. So is it really relevant that our assets or the value of our wealth as South Africans is not keeping up?
I think it is relevant. It's relevant in like several areas. I can't think of, let's put it this way, I can't think of a reason why it would be a good thing. So let's say why could it be a bad thing? Having an asset is really important because previously we've spoken about just the social impact. I mean, if you have an asset, then you have something to protect, you have something to fight for, and we've seen that in the insurrections and the uprisings. People that had something to fight for, like the taxi industry, for example. So having an asset is really important for social stability, and as you say, creating a middle class. But it's very important for progressing in society from a financial perspective, because if you have an asset, then you can borrow against that asset to buy another asset or to invest in another asset. I mean, a classic example would be a home. If you want to get a home loan, you have to have a deposit. So you've got to be able to, that could be 20% of the value. So you've got to be able to get that money somewhere. And that could be an asset that you've had, maybe you build up an asset, some kind of an investment portfolio, and you use that. But if you've got a home and then you've paid down a portion of your bond, then you can access a portion of that bond and maybe invest a little bit in a business, or maybe, take a portion of your bond to fund your child's education, or maybe, and so it's critical to have an asset,
but
to
relative,
be able to,
relative to the rest of the world. And I think this is really I don't think anybody could argue with you what you've just said now, but is it important that South African assets keep track with those of elsewhere in the world? I'm being devil's advocate here. I do have the answer,
it depends. I mean, I guess,
yeah.
Listen, it depends what you mean elsewhere in the world. I mean, because these things are quite difficult to measure. So, for example, one of the things you would look at is sort of household wealth to GDP. And you can say we can compare that around the world. And the US has always been right at the very top of the household or the household assets to GDP. So if you look, generally speaking, the most prosperous countries tend to have the highest wealth levels relative to GDP. So it is important, not because it's a competition between who's the wealthiest country, but it's who has the most financial resources to uplift society. And I'm not saying the US has done the best job, because in many instances they're very wealthy, but they also have quite a skewed income. But it certainly gives you much more flexibility, because the bigger your wealth, the more wealth there is in a country, then the more people will spend. So that will lead to higher GDP. The more GDP in a country, the higher the taxes for the government to spend, and to hopefully to spend that fruitfully. So it is important, but the relative is hard to do. But for example, in South Africa, we have very high inflation. So if you compare us to the US, we have inflation 5-6%, and that's relatively low, because sort of 15 years ago it was at almost 10%. But in other countries, you've got very low inflation, 1-2%. Now, what happens in a high inflation environment is that even if your assets, let's say we have a 5% inflation, and let's just say your assets go up by 5%, so they're not growing ahead of inflation, but you're actually taxed in nominal terms. So that would be bad, because you're actually paying more tax, because tax actually works in a nominal environment, not a real environment. And so the point being is that you want to have an attractive environment where asset prices go up, because if I've got a business or a property, I'd like to sell that at some kind of profit, and then that'll motivate me to invest more and more.
Well, the investment, you sacrifice to build wealth. And if there is no benefit of your sacrifice, you stop sacrificing, and then you don't create jobs. And
you take your money offshore. As an example, you might take your money offshore. You might say, and obviously, Magnus has been quite strong on that, but you might say, well, and we need investment to create jobs. So, you want to create an attractive investment horizon for everyone to benefit from.
Stephen, the whole story about, and that really flows quite well into a conversation that we're going to have in a little while with Terence Corrigan, who's been banging the drum against expropriation without compensation. This policy that the ANC and the EFF have been collaborating on to change the constitution so that they effectively can steal from citizens. Now there's been a bust up between them. The EFF wants more than the ANC is prepared to deliver, and I guess those who don't want to see expropriation without compensation going through are celebrating now on the news that they aren't going to be voting together. But how important is that? Is the fact that we have property rights, and that your property that you own cannot be taken away from you by the state, as is being proposed in South Africa?
Property rights is one of the most fundamental rights for a fair, free, and prosperous economy, both for its citizens and for international companies and people to invest in that country. So it's almost, if you had a look at the top three, criteria, it would definitely be in the top three, because who would invest in a country, both if you're a citizen or if you're a foreigner, who would invest in that country if there was a reasonable chance that your investment could go to naught? And if we look at what's happening in China, that is, there's elements of that. There's elements of we're not being protected, and maybe the investments we thought we had is actually not really an investment because it's done through some kind of a structure that might not be legal in that country. And we can see what that has done to the Chinese tech companies in a very short space of time, and that's symptomatic. Who would invest in that country? And there's so many places to invest that in order to attract capital, you've got to stack up to that criteria that meets with a reasonable investment. Because imagine investing in a country where they said that it's now public knowledge, this expropriation without compensation, and you go in and you invest money there. It'd be very difficult to explain that to your investment committee or your trustees if you were a foreigner. So it's very, very concerning. And I think it caught a lot of us offsides, because it wasn't an ANC policy. And we've seen even President Mbeki come out and say, no, this actually is not an ANC policy, and this is not what the ANC wanted and stood for. So it's very controversial all around, even within the ANC. And as you say, it seems to be that the radical economic transformation side of the ANC were probably pushing this agenda, and it's good to see that the ANC now is not siding with the EFF, that there are differences, and that this is in jeopardy. So that in itself is a good sign. But given the issues we have in this country, you just wish that government would focus on the imperatives that are actually going to create growth and create jobs. Not a lot of the sideshows. I would say sideshows, but certainly not a lot of the things that actually aren't going to have a positive impact in the short term. In fact, they might have a very detrimental impact. But we just need focus on areas that matter to address our problems for all of South Africa.